Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. I want to take you right back to Wisconsin to the Jayme Patterson sentencing. The prosecutor is addressing the judge. Let's listen in. All right, you've been watching from inside that courtroom in Wisconsin for the sentencing of Jayme Patterson. We heard some very emotional victim impact statements, also hearing a lengthy statement from the prosecutor as he went by step what happened to that little girl and her parents. And now we're hearing from the defense attorney. So I've got to ask Katrina Kaufman, attorney here with me on set, where is he going with this argument? What is he trying to achieve here?
Honestly, that's what I'm trying to figure out. I think that he's maybe trying to get them to put parole on the table, even though they're acknowledging that he's going to spend his life in prison. But it sounds like there are additional resources he would have if parole was at least a potential option for him.
And it also sounds like he had some issue with the pre-sentencing memo and how that was done. The defense attorney really talking about that. We're listening to Jayme Patterson's defense attorney addressing the judge there. We've been listening to the sentencing hearing for about an hour and a half now. I'm here with Katrina Kaufman, David Katz. Thank you, both my legal analyst guests on the panel. We've been listening to this, some very, very disturbing stuff, especially as we heard the prosecutor go through play by play the terror that little girl must have felt, 13 years old, when she's trapped inside a bathroom with a man with a gun approaching, her mom hugging her, and then being in the same room as her mother is shot to death. Just terrifying. Right now, defense attorneys, basically, as far as I can understand, Katrina, trying to ask for parole, knowing that he'll die in prison, but this is a way he can get some kind of mental health.
Yeah, that's the impression that I'm getting from what they're saying, that they acknowledge he deserves to spend life in prison, that the sentence should be structured as such, but if they give him the option of parole, then there'll be some services that he wouldn't otherwise receive, I guess, in Wisconsin.
David Katz, thanks so much for joining us here. Okay, is there any way you think this judge is going to give him the possibility of parole after the heinous acts that he's admitted to committing? I can't imagine. There would be outrage. There would be protests on the street.
Well, my opinion may not hold up in an hour or an hour and a half, but I don't see any way that the judge could give parole in this case. It just seems to me that this is a case for sentencing without parole, without the possibility of parole. It's just an extraordinarily heinous case. Apparently, even people who've studied these kinds of awful crimes say this one's really beyond the pale. They just can't understand what the motivation was, which makes you think of a mental defense, but he didn't put on a defense of mental disease or defect as to guilt or innocence, which really, I think there'll be a lot of second guessing that might have been a much more sensible way to go, because this seems like a completely insane, horrible offense.
It certainly does, but I have to tell you, the defense attorney we were just listening to, and he's there too, still addressing the court, I was a little bit lost, Katrina, of where he was going with all of this. It kind of seemed like he was rambling about his personal contact with the case as opposed to the facts at hand. I found that a little odd.
Yeah, I agree. It seemed like he maybe didn't even want to be assigned to this case, and that they're just sort of at a loss as to how to defend this guy. And maybe they feel like if they create some sort of personal narrative, they'll get empathy. I don't know. I don't even understand
David,
either.
you'll agree really quickly. It was very strange.
I got the feeling that he was trying to make this a run-of-the-mill sentencing when it's such an extraordinary sentencing, to just sort of talk about just minutia, like, avoiding the elephant in the room, which is that, as you said, his client murdered two people.
I got to cut you off. I'm so sorry. We got to take a very quick break here on the Law and Crime Network. We'll take you back inside the courtroom in Wisconsin for the sentencing of Jayme Patterson. Just seconds ago, a judge sentencing Jayme Patterson to life without the possibility of parole after his defense attorneys begging the judge to give him the option of having that parole so he can get some psychological services that he apparently needed in prison. And I have to say, this was a really unbelievable moment. The judge talking about the pre-sentencing report and some of the things that Jayme Patterson had said, like how he wanted to do this to more women. And then all of a sudden you can see Jayme Patterson nodding his head, having some kind of outburst when the judge was actually talking and handing down the sentence. We're going back right now to rewind to see exactly what he said. Obviously, he disagreed with what the judge said, but David Katz, former federal prosecutor here with us, have you ever seen anything like this before during a sentencing where you actually have the defendant interrupting a judge?
Well, actually, there have been situations like this because especially it was clear to him that he was about to get no parole, a life sentence, and it was being detailed just what awful things he had said out of his own mouth or out of his own hand in that letter. So I think that's when the defendant started talking back to the judge. Never a good idea, but I had a lot of questions with the whole strategy that the defense pursued, not just the defendant, but I had a lot of issues with the defense presentation. I think when you're quoting people like Lincoln and Eleanor Roosevelt, they're going to say, well, look, it's Mr. Patterson who's here, not Mr. Lincoln, not Mrs. Roosevelt. And I knew they were going to turn that back against him, the liberty and justice for all. You're going to get justice for all today, and all includes your client. And the justice for your client is a sentence of without parole. I guess the thing that I have a question about, and I'm sure a lot of viewers have this question, is why didn't they present more of a vigorous psychiatric mitigating circumstances for sentencing? It's one thing not to put on a trial where you dispute guilt or you say you have diminished actuality or something like that, diminished capacity as it used to be called, but why not put on a defense for sentencing? The judge said, you keep telling me you have all these problems. I've heard it from your lawyers. I don't have a shred of paper in front of me that says that you have psychiatric problems from a psychiatrist. I don't know why the defense allowed that to happen.
And from my understanding, it was that Jake Patterson himself would not comply with anything regarding talking to anyone for the pre-sentencing memo. So perhaps it was his own decision.
If I can just say, the Supreme Court has ruled that a defendant has the right to control the defendant's defense. And even if the lawyer thinks it's not the best defense or the defendant is missing a great defense, it is the defendant's right to control his or her defense. Having said that, something was very askew over here because it just seems obvious that there was a psychological defense that should have been presented on behalf of this person. This was a shockingly horrible crime, which just seems naturally to have flowed from some kind of mental disease or defect, which should have been presented. And he had nothing to lose by putting it on. There's apparently no death penalty. He got the worst sentence he could have. Why not put on that mental defense first at the trial stage and then put it on at the sentencing stage?
But at the same time, then, you know, as the attorneys for Jake Patterson mentioned, then you deal with all the taxpayer expenses of going to trial with this. And, you know, it didn't seem like he had much of a mental health history as far as anyone could tell. There were no reports, there were no issues, there were no previous convictions, anything like that. What did you think of the defense's tactic, Katrina? What we just saw right here?
I didn't find it compelling at all. It just kind of felt like he was rambling, he was quoting great people, and there wasn't really anything very persuasive in those statements.
No, it didn't. It seemed very rambling. I would agree with you. And also, it seemed very personal. One of the attorneys taking this like very personal when it's their job to defend someone, not make it about them. So I agree with both of you. I found what the defense said not to be very persuasive and probably not the best representation for their client. Let's talk now yes, David.
Look, the defense attorney said something very telling. He said, my partner and I on the defense team, we have decades of experience, and when you don't get a plea agreement and your client is facing the worst possible sentence, it's ineffective assistance of counsel not to put on a defense. And then they went ahead and basically didn't put on a defense. Now, there may be some point at which you just cannot put on a defense because your client is so reluctant to do that. But, you know, as you folks pointed out, he did say something at sentencing. He made an allocution, which I didn't expect. So he said something there. He wrote a letter. Given that he was willing to do all of that, why wouldn't this defendant have put on a mental defense? That didn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. And why is he writing letters? I mean, I know you can't control how much what your client does, but that's just, and again, it's because, you know, I'm in the adversarial system. I'm looking at it from the point of view now of a defense attorney, not the point of view that this was a horrible person, as they said, an incarnation of evil, I think the judge said, or the embodiment of evil. But having said that, Okay, to have your client writing letters that are self-destructive when you're trying to defend the person, you're in the system, and in terms of costing the taxpayers money, that's not your problem. First of all, they were court-appointed attorneys. They spent some of the taxpayers' money right there. Put on the trial, put on a defense, at least have a psychiatrist report on him. They said he wouldn't speak to any psychiatrist. You have to have some suasion with your client and say to him, you need to talk to these psychiatrists.
But you know,
this can help
David,
you.
there are some circumstances where you're just it's out, as an attorney, it's out of your control. And if your client won't agree to anything, what can you possibly do? If he's writing notes from prison, from jail to the media, if he's writing these other notes, you really have, no matter what you advise him, ultimately you have very little control over what he does.
I have some questions about his competence. That's something that you have to have tested too. Competence and other things like that. The court shouldn't have a proceeding where someone is incompetent, where someone is that self-destructive. That's another issue that at least you want the judge to get involved with. Maybe you're right. You can't get an order from the judge. You can't get your client to cooperate. And maybe they did everything within their power. But I think that's what's going to be the basis of watch the habeas corpus petition about the defense attorneys were ineffective. I think
we'll
that's coming
see
down
if
the
that
pipe.
happens. Okay, we have a lot to get to, including I want to replay Jake Patterson's statement to the court. It was very, very short, but it's worth you hearing. We have to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Stay with us. We are following breaking news. A lot going on this afternoon. Just minutes ago, a judge sentenced Jake Patterson to life without the possibility of parole for killing Jayme Kloss's parents and kidnapping her for 3 months. The judge called it the most heinous and dangerous crime he has ever seen here in Wisconsin and maybe in the United States. It was an emotional sentencing hearing that lasted about 3 hours. Jayme Kloss's attorney read a statement on her behalf. Powerful words from that young girl, only 13 years old, when Jake Patterson kidnapped her from her own home and kept her captive in his house for 88 days. And during the course of that sentencing, we actually saw pictures of where she stayed. I want to bring in my legal experts. It was just so terrifying. It was a bed where he trapped her underneath this bed and basically wouldn't let her out for 12 hours for 12 hours at a time without bathroom breaks. Just a terrifying, horrifying ordeal that she had to go through. And Katrina, I imagine her attorney made the right move in not having her actually come to court and read that statement and having someone else do that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think to put her through having to face him again would just be unfair. I mean, she's shown so much heroism in escaping and being able to move forward with her life. And I thought her words were incredibly powerful on their own, being read by him.
So you agree, David, you wouldn't have had her come in and read that, would you have?
No, definitely. When I was a prosecutor, I would have wanted to do that in the same fashion. Because it wasn't a trial, there wasn't any issue of the defendant having a right to confront her in the courtroom. And so with all of that taken into account, I think it was very powerful. And it would have just turned it into more of a, I don't know if a circus is the right word, but you didn't want to do anything that you think would increase this sort of grandiose notion that Patterson would have, or this idea that he could force her, even at this stage, to come to court and to make her statement. And the statement was very effective the way it was written. It really made you shudder, didn't it?
It certainly did. Just such a horrible thing for her to have to go through. We were just listening to a press conference out of Wisconsin as law enforcement officials, the district attorney, and a member representing the family saying that they were pleased with the outcome of a judge sentencing Jake Patterson to life without the possibility of parole for the kidnapping of that 13-year-old girl there that you see on your screen, Jayme Kloss, and the killing of her two parents. Very quickly, I think we have time, Katrina, for quick last thoughts from you and David.
I mean, I think it was really gratifying to see how happy everyone seems to be with the outcome. I mean, given the circumstances of this case, that this is the best possible thing they could have asked for.
Obviously, they don't have the death penalty here in Wisconsin.
Well, yes, it's a wonderful thing that young lady was able to escape and get home and all of that. I guess my closing thoughts from it as a defense attorney is I just really think that there were some things that should have been pursued there.
Okay, David, sorry to cut you off once again. We have to take a break. The Daily Debrief will be up next.